first of all, and to introduce to everyone Brad Roper and Liz. Liz, is it Fritsch? Fritsch? How do you pronounce it?
Fritchie.
Fritchie. Okay. And of course, they are with Southern Glaciers Wine and Spirits. Liz is pulling double duty tonight, so she's, if you can believe it, she's got another event. But she said we are in very, very good hands with Brad, who is our bourbon major, like he knows everything. Let's put it that way. So I'm going to go ahead and change the slide here real fast. This is what our first segment is going to be. So we're going to be talking about the difference between Scotch, Irish whiskey, Canadian rye, wheat, and bourbon. So Mr. Roper, take it away.
All right. Can everybody hear me?
Yes, sir.
All right. Well, first, thanks for having me on. Bourbon, tequila, spirits are my passion, and I get excited about it, especially for people that haven't necessarily drank them. I know every bourbon tasting we do, I have people that walk up and they say, I don't like bourbon, I can't drink whiskey. My wife was that way, and now she can just drink whiskey straight. It's just getting to know what you like and kind of easing yourself into it like you would with any other spirit. So I'm not going to get super technical tonight, kind of a bourbon 101, if you will. Just if you have questions, obviously it's a smaller group, so just speak up or stop me, and we'll kind of just do a little back and forth, and I'll run through it. We're going to try to keep it fairly short. So let's get started. So the biggest thing that everyone gets confused on is the categories of what's whiskey and then what does it mean to be Scotch, Irish, bourbon, rye. So let's talk about that a little bit. Whiskey is the big overarching umbrella. So everything's going to fall under the category of whiskey. Now you'll see it spelled whiskey with an E at the end, E-Y, or just whiskey without. That doesn't mean anything different. It's just different countries use it differently. The easy way to remember it is if how you spell the country, if it has an E in the spelling, for instance, the United States has an E, we use the E. If it's Canada, they do not use the E. So fun little fact, if you're ever making a piece of art or you need to spell it out, if it's Canadian, no E. Same with Ireland, Scotland, all that. So whiskey's the big category. Then you've got Scotch. Scotch is the main difference with Scotch versus what we do here in America is that they use peat. If you ever drank Scotch, it's going to have a lot of that smokiness to it. A lot of people are saying, oh, it tastes like an ashtray. It's not really my style. The peat is what they use because they didn't have a lot of trees when they were actually burning and heating up all the grains. They would use peat, which is basically just decompressed soil. Picture like a piece of sod, but it's basically been years and years of decompressed and it's really wet. And that's what they would use almost like charcoal. And when you use that, it's smoking everything that you're basically baking in smoke. And that gets put into the grain and then put into the spirit. So obviously a lot of people that are cigar smokers, they like their scotches because it's smoked to taste with smoke. Now, all scotches aren't super smoky, but they all have that certain taste. They usually finish with that smokiness. The other big difference is their main ingredient that they use is malted barley, where our bourbon fans in America, our main ingredient is corn. So you're going to get a whole different taste profile just like you would with baking. I always tell people with whiskey to think like you're a baker because it's all about those grains that they use in it, and they're all going to taste a little different. So Scotch and Irish whiskey are barley forward, and that's where the Europeans grew up on that. We grew up on corn, right? Cornmeal's in everything we eat, and that's why we love our bourbon here in America. So Scotch, it's got the peat, got smoke, aged 3 years. Irish, same thing. It's going to be barley forward, aged 3 years also at a minimum as a whiskey. And then Irish whiskey is almost, to me, it's got this different style. If anyone here has ever been a Jameson drinker or had like an Irish car bomb, it's got a little bit more of a sweetness to it and less of a harsh finish than a Scotch would. I always tell people if they want to get into whiskey, to get into Irish whiskeys or Canadian whiskeys first. Just because it kind of, to me, it eases you into the palate before you start drinking heavy bourbons or heavy scotches. All right, so then we've got Canadian. The biggest difference in Canadian whiskey, if you're going to start drinking whiskey, everyone loves Crown, right? We've all heard of Crown Royal. So Canadian whiskey, the difference is that they're allowed to add flavoring. So in the laws, they have 9% that they can add flavoring. So what they do in Canada usually is add coloring and sugar. So if you take a Canadian whiskey versus a American whiskey or a Scotch, usually they're going to be sweeter. So I always tell people, start with Canadians. If you want to do it with Coke, sweetness with sweetness. It kind of helps you get into that category. And that's why a lot of people around the world and in America are not, they kind of push against Canadian whiskey because they sort of get to cheat the system by adding sugar and color to it. So now let's go to America. I'm flying through this, so stop me if you have questions. We'll in not only America but in all whiskeys, there's a few different categories, and the biggest number to remember is 51%. So 51% is going to tell you what it is. So I've got a few bottles I'll try to demonstrate here because everyone walks the shelves when you're in the whiskey section and you don't know what you're grabbing. So the first one we'll look at is just bourbon. So bourbon is America's, kind of namesake right now, what's so popular. Bourbon, a lot of people get confused, and they think bourbon means Kentucky. That is where it's mostly from right now. But bourbon is actually can be made anywhere in America. So there's Missouri bourbon now being produced. There's California bourbon. So it's not just Kentucky, but Kentucky's definitely the most popular. They have really good water in Kentucky that makes great bourbon. So the laws or the rules of whiskey are when you put that word on there, I'll try to show you a little bit, but when you have the word bourbon on the bottle, 51% corn. So as you're learning and you figure out what style you like, when you see bourbon, you think corn. Corn's very smooth, a little bit more mellow. Then you've got rye whiskeys. So you'll notice this bottle. Hopefully you can kind of see it there. You won't see the word bourbon because when it says rye on it, now you're at at least 51% rye. So if you think like a baker, if you've had rye bread versus like a cornbread, that's going to change your flavor profiles. And I'm a rye drinker. I love rye, but I also like rye bread. I like that little bit of almost peppery spice that you get. It's not overwhelming, but you can definitely pick it up. You've also got another category here that is a wheat whiskey. I'm hoping you guys can see these a little bit. But that doesn't say bourbon, it says wheat whiskey. Maker's wheat for whiskey. So a lot of people fall in love with it because, again, we grew up on bread and corn. So wheat whiskeys are very popular as you're getting into them. A lot of people use that as gifts. This one's called Bernheim. It's a great wheat forward, just different grains, different recipes, if you will. So that's kind of the quick rundown. So if you're shopping, those are the categories you want to look for. If you think you want to try something smoky, you're going to lean toward the Scotch. If you want to get into the category, you've never really drank them, start with the Canadian, something sweeter. But then once you're into those American whiskeys, think about it as a baker. Do you like corn? I love cornbread, so I'm going to go with a bourbon. But if you like rye bread and things like that, and you want something with a little spice or pepper, check out a rye. We'll move it back to you there, Susan.
Well, so my question to you then, and you mentioned that rye was one of your favorites. Are they all your favorite? If you had to have your druthers, what would be your favorite?
All of them. No, I'm just kidding. It's funny. I go through kind of phases, kind of like wine. I know there's a lot of wine drinkers out there that in the summer you drink white wine, right? And in the winter you drink red wine. So with me, with whiskey, it's about, a lot of it, we'll get into it too, is what they call the proof or the alcohol content. So I usually drink lighter whiskeys in the summer, or I make cocktails, which we're going to make a great summer whiskey cocktail today. But in the winter, I'll just drink them more straight, less mixers, less, cocktail-esque. I'll just drink higher proof, kind of warms you up a little bit more, But they're all great, and I go back and forth. I don't necessarily have a true favorite.
Nice. All right, so in the chat, very quickly, put what your favorite of those are. Bourbon, rye, put it in the chat what you guys' favorite is. We'll see what answers we've got here. Bourbon we have, bourbon, okay. Irish, all right. Excellent. All right. So that's our first segment. I was going to, hopefully we had a few more people join us, but you know what? She doesn't know yet. Nikki doesn't know yet. She's new to bourbon and whiskey. So I have a question for you. Where does Southern Comfort fit in all that realm?
So Southern Comfort's more of a liqueur.
Right.
It's got some whiskey base to it, but it's definitely a lot of sugar content in it.
Yes.
It's almost closer to me to a rum than it would be a whiskey.
That
They
makes
have a newer one that's more whiskey forward called Southern Comfort 80 that is definitely more whiskey. But SoCo, it's why it works with a hurricane. Think of it like a rum, more sugary drink.
right.
So
Lots of calories. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
exactly.
That's our first segment, and we are going to be doing, let me share this really